The 17th Academy looked like the other 16 from orbit. Clean lines, bright alloy, that particular shade of institutional white that every Vethani chartered facility seemed to pull from the same catalog. I watched it resolve on the shuttle's forward display as we dropped through the cloud layer, and I made my first note of the day on the compliance form clipped to my board. Velaran Academy of Environmental Sciences. Vethani Charter, 3rd Revision. Enrollment Audit Joint Standards Commission Human Vethani Protocol 7. Auditor T. Renner. Date of observation, as stamped. I'd been doing this for 4 years. Before that, I'd done something else for 14. Search and rescue. Mountain operations, mostly. The Cascades, the Rockies. A 3-year rotation in the Southern Alps that I still dreamed about when the weather shifted. 14 years of reading terrain, reading weather, reading the difference between a slope that would hold your weight and one that would send you down 400 meters of scree into a drainage you'd need a helicopter to get out of. The compliance work paid better and didn't require me to sleep on a rock shelf in freezing rain, so I considered it a lateral promotion. My knees agreed. My eyes didn't care either way. They kept doing what they'd always done, which was look at things and tell me what they meant. The Human Vethani Joint Enrollment Standards Commission existed because the treaty said it had to, and I existed because the commission needed someone who would sit in the back of alien classrooms for 8 hours without falling asleep. I had a talent for it. I could watch paint dry in 3 languages and produce a form at the end that satisfied both species' bureaucracies. The shuttle set down on a landing apron that smelled like ozone and heated alloy. A Vethani liaison was waiting, tall, narrow-shouldered, 4 hands folded in the formal configuration that meant professional courtesy without personal warmth. The name on the badge read Coordinator Orath Sen. Auditor Renner. Coordinator. Your schedule has been prepared. 3rd term practicals in environmental pattern recognition occupy the first 4 hours. Administrative records review follows. Meals are available in the faculty annex. That's fine. She handed me an observer badge, a flat disc of pale metal with a single glyph that meant, in Vethani administrative shorthand, present but not participating. I'd worn 16 of these. They all looked the same. I clipped it to my jacket pocket, picked up my clipboard, and followed her across the apron toward the main building. Velaran was mid-tier, not the flagship academies like Velcassar or the old Kale Von Complex, but solid, a regional institution that trained cadets for planetary survey work, environmental hazard assessment, geological mapping. The kind of place that produced competent field operators who spent their careers cataloging mineral deposits and filing atmospheric reports. The campus was built on a plateau above a river valley, and whoever had sited it had chosen well. The terrain visible from the main approach offered a textbook cross-section of montane geology, 3 distinct biome transitions, and a weather pattern that probably gave the environmental science faculty fresh teaching material every afternoon. I noticed that the way I noticed everything, automatically, without deciding to, the way you hear music playing in a room you've walked into even when you came for a different reason. The academy had been chartered for 208 years. In that time, 1 human had enrolled. She transferred out after a term. The enrollment file listed the reason as curriculum incompatibility, which could have meant anything from homesickness to the food. My job was to determine whether the academy's enrollment practices met joint protocol standards for interspecies access. In practice, that meant sitting in classrooms, reviewing forms and writing observations that would be read by a committee, filed, and never acted upon. I didn't mind. There were worse ways to spend a week. Coordinator Orethsen walked me through the main corridor, wide, bright, that same institutional alloy, and stopped outside a set of double doors marked with the Vethani glyph for applied learning space. Lecture Theater 7, Instructor Vel Sarath. The 3rd term environmental pattern recognition practical begins in 12 minutes. Your seat is in the rear observation tier. She paused, and two of her four hands made a small adjustment that I'd learned to read as mild discomfort. Instructor Velsareth has been informed of your presence. The cadets have not. That's standard. Some may react. They usually do. She left me at the door. I let myself in. Lecture Theater 7 was built in the tiered half-circle layout that Vethani institutions favored, descending rows of workstations focused on a central demonstration floor. Each station had a console, a display screen, and a docking mount for the instrument I'd read about in the pre-audit briefing, the Keth-Vor Environmental Analysis Matrix. It was a sensor array about the size of a human toolbox, matte gray, covered in calibration ports and data feeds. Every station had one. They sat in their docking mounts like blunt instruments waiting to be picked up. The central floor held a holographic projector, a wide, flat ring built into the floor with emitter arrays spaced around its circumference. It was cold now, dark glass, but I'd seen these before. When they fired, they could project a three-dimensional environmental field up to 30 meters across, with active weather, geological processes, biological systems, and atmospheric dynamics running in real time. The cadets would assess the projected field using their instrument arrays. The array would process the data. The cadet would compile a report, standard pedagogy. I found the observation tier, a single row of seats at the very top of the theater, behind and above the last row of cadet workstations. I sat down, set my clipboard on the narrow desk surface, and opened to a fresh compliance form. The form had 7 sections. I'd filled out hundreds of them. My handwriting was small, even, and legible, which was more than the commission's review committee deserved. Below, cadets were filing in. There were 31 of them, mostly Sulan, heavy-boned, dark-skinned, with the paired pressure organs running along their jawlines that made them natural atmospheric readers. A handful of Vethani, 2 Dreth, recognizable by their flattened cranial ridges and the way they angled their heads to catch scent. No humans. There hadn't been a human in this room since the transfer student 6 years ago, and she hadn't stayed long enough to reach the third-term practicals. The instructor arrived last. Velsareth was Dren, shorter than the Sulan cadets, compact, with the smooth, mottled skin that marked the species. The modeling wasn't random. Dren chromatophores were emotional telltales, involuntary color displays that shifted with cognitive and affective state. Right now Velsareth's forearms and throat showed a steady, uniform slate, the Dren baseline for focused professional calm. Teaching mode. Stations, Velsareth said. The cadets moved to their workstations. Instrument arrays were unracked. Calibration sequences initiated. The theater filled with the quiet hum of 31 Keth-Vor units cycling through their boot protocols. I made a note, boot time. I'd time it later. Velsareth walked to the holographic projector ring, entered a code on the floor console, and looked up at the theater. That was when the Sulan in the third row turned around and saw me. He was large even by Sulan standards, broad across the chest, heavy-jawed, with pressure organs that were visibly developed, the kind of prominent sensory architecture that came from years of deliberate training. His workstation badge read DRNNVUSS, Tier 2, and the console display showed a calibration pattern I recognized from the briefing materials as an advanced operator's layout. He was the cohort's best instrument operator. His file said so. 3 terms at the top of every ranked assessment. Consistently first to complete, highest accuracy scores, 2 commendations from the environmental sciences faculty. He was the student this program was built to produce. He looked at me, the way a mechanic looks at a bird that's flown into the garage. Instructor, there is a human in the observation tier. A few other cadets turned. The Dreth angled their heads. A Vethani in the front row adjusted all 4 hands on her console without looking away from me, as if my presence required a physical recalibration she could manage while multitasking. The room's attention shifted from the exercise setup to the back row, for exactly as long as it took them to register what I was and decide how much I mattered. For most of them, the answer was not much. An observer, a bureaucrat with a clipboard, the institutional equivalent of a weather sensor on the wall, present, recording, irrelevant to the work. Drenvos didn't share that assessment. Instructor, there is a human in the observation tier, he said again, louder, in case the first time had been insufficiently clear. Velsareth didn't look up from the floor console. Compliance Auditor, Joint Enrollment Standards Commission, observation only. He is not a participant. He's not a cadet. No. He has no instrument clearance. He has an observer badge, Cadet Drenvos. It is sufficient. Please complete your calibration. Drenvos held the look for another 2 seconds. The pressure organs along his jaw flexed once. A Sulan autonomic response I'd learned to read as displeasure without escalation. Then he turned back to his console. I wrote a note on my compliance form, Cadet reaction to human observer, verbal challenge resolved by instructor, no hostility, standard range. I'd written that sentence or something like it at 11 of the previous 16 academies. It was almost its own template by now. Velsareth activated the holographic projector. The ring in the floor pulsed once, and then the theater filled with terrain. It was good work. The emitter array was high resolution, better than some of the flagship academies I'd visited. The projected field rose from the central floor in a column of light and color, and resolved into a three-dimensional landscape roughly 20 meters across at its widest point, rendered with enough fidelity that I could see individual tree crowns, water surface texture, and the grain of exposed rock faces. The survey field was mountainous. A ridgeline ran north-south through the center, dropping on the western face into a forested valley with a river system threading through it. The eastern face was steeper, rockier scree slopes and exposed geological strata in bands of red and gray. The valley floor showed dense canopy cover, thinning toward the river margins. Weather systems were active, a cloud deck building from the west-northwest, layered, with the upper stratum moving faster than the lower. There was wind. I could see it in the way the canopy moved, the ripple pattern on the river surface, the drift of the cloud shadows across the valley floor. The field had biological indicators too. Small shapes moved in the canopy, avian analogs probably, based on their flight pattern. Something larger moved through the undergrowth near the river. The vegetation showed variation, healthy growth in the valley center, stress indicators at the margins where the canopy thinned and the soil changed color. It was a teaching environment, designed to test whether a cadet could use the Kethvor array to compile a comprehensive environmental assessment, atmospheric conditions, geological stability, biological threat profile, resource availability, weather forecast, and hazard summary. A complete survey field report. Standard operational output for a planetary survey team. Your assessment window is 40 minutes, Velsareth said. Full environmental profile, 7 categories. Submit to the central console when complete. Begin. The cadets began. I watched them work, which was my job. Each cadet had the Kethvor array mounted at their station, sensors angled toward the holographic field. They ran calibration passes first, atmospheric baseline, electromagnetic interference compensation, biological motion filtering. The process was methodical. I could see the difference between the cadets who had internalized the calibration sequence and those who were still referencing their procedure displays. Drenvos didn't reference anything. His hands moved over the array controls with the fluid economy of someone who had done this enough times that the instrument was an extension of his cognition. His pressure organs flexed rhythmically as he worked, reading the atmospheric data the array was feeding back, cross-referencing it against his own biological sensitivity to pressure gradients. The Sulan had a natural advantage here. Their pressure-reading organs could detect atmospheric changes at resolutions the Vethani and Dreth cadets needed the array's full sensor suite to match. I made a note about the calibration process, how long it took, which species completed it fastest, whether the instruction had addressed multi-species ergonomic variation in the array's interface design, standard compliance observations, the kind of thing that would occupy 3 lines in my final report and produce no detectable change in the Academy's operations. But the forms existed because the treaty said they had to, and I filled them out because that was the job I'd chosen when I stopped sleeping on mountainsides. Then I looked at the survey field again. I hadn't meant to. The compliance form had 26 boxes, and I was only on box 7. There was no reason for me to be looking at the holographic terrain instead of at the cadets operating their instruments, which was what the protocol required. But the field was 20 meters wide and projected at a resolution that put individual leaf shadows on the canopy floor, and my eyes had spent 14 years being trained to process exactly this kind of information. Terrain, weather, biome, threat, and the training didn't care that I was holding a clipboard instead of a topographic map. The cloud deck had built since the exercise started. The lower stratum was thickening, and the upper stratum's leading edge had moved roughly 3 degrees south of where it had been at activation. I didn't calculate that. I saw it. The same way I'd seen cloud movement across ridgelines for 14 years in the Cascades, in the Rockies, in the Southern Alps, in every mountain range where I'd spent weeks at a time reading weather, because the helicopter wasn't coming, and the weather was what decided whether you walked out or got carried. It wasn't a skill I'd chosen to learn. Nobody sits down and decides to learn cloud reading the way you decide to learn a language or an instrument. You learn it by being in the weather, day after day, year after year, until the patterns are in your nervous system, and your eyes process them the way your ears process speech. Without translation, without effort, without the intermediate step of thinking about what you're seeing. A 3-layer cloud system was as legible to me as a sentence in English. I didn't decode it. I read it. I didn't mean to assess the field. That wasn't my job. My job was to watch the cadets and fill out Section 3 of the compliance form. But the field was right there, projected at full resolution 20 meters in front of me, and my eyes did what they'd always done. The cloud deck was a 3-layer system. The upper layer was Cirrus equivalent, thin, fast, moving on a jet stream analog from the west-northwest. The middle layer was building cumulus packing, vertical development starting. The lower layer was valley fog, pooling in the river corridor, which meant the valley floor temperature had dropped relative to the ridgeline. That was a thermal inversion. It meant the weather was going to shift. The timeline depended on the rate of cumulus development in the middle layer, and I could estimate that from the rate the cloud shadows were darkening on the valley floor. 22 minutes, maybe 25. Rain on the western ridge face first, then the valley. Wind shift from west-northwest to southwest as the front came through. The river would rise. The valley fog would burn off in the leading edge of the precipitation, which would briefly improve visibility before the main system closed in. I wrote this in the margin of my compliance form, next to the box for Section 4 observations. I didn't think about it. It was the same kind of note I'd written on the margins of search and rescue planning maps for a decade and a half. The observations that went between the formal entries, the ones that were just for me, so I'd remember what the sky looked like when I was making decisions. Below, the cadets were still calibrating. The soil color in the holographic field told me something too. The valley floor was dark, rich, organic, well-watered. But at the margins, where the tree cover thinned and the slope began to rise, the soil shifted to a paler, grainier composition. That transition line wasn't random. It followed a contour that suggested a subsurface feature, an aquifer probably, running roughly parallel to the river but offset to the east by 40 or 50 meters. The vegetation above the aquifer line was deeper rooted and more drought resistant than the vegetation in the river margin zone. You could see it in the leaf color. The river margin trees were brighter, more surface water, less need for deep root systems. The aquifer-lined trees were darker, denser, and their canopy was less affected by the wind. The difference was subtle. At this resolution, from the observation tier, it was the kind of thing you'd miss entirely unless you knew to look for it. Unless someone had walked you across a hillside once and told you what the trees were saying. I'd learned to read aquifer indicators on a geology field course when I was 23. A professor named Harlan walked us across a hillside in eastern Oregon and pointed at the vegetation line and said, "That's where the water is. The trees will tell you." Half the class wrote it in their notebooks. I wrote it in my nervous system. It wasn't complicated. It was the kind of thing you learned once and then saw everywhere in every landscape for the rest of your life. Once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. Every hillside, every ridgeline, every river valley, the trees are always talking, and once you learn the language, you can't unhear it. I wrote the aquifer estimate in the margin. Depth, 4 meters, give or take. Accessible by excavation at the contour where the vegetation stress line crossed the rockfall deposit on the eastern slope. I noted the coordinates relative to the survey field's reference grid, because my handwriting was good and the margin was wide enough. 20 minutes into the exercise, the cadets were running their primary assessment passes now. I could hear the Kethvor units cycling through their sensor sweeps, a faint harmonic hum that rose and fell as each array processed a different data channel. Atmospheric, geological, biological, thermal. Each channel produced a data stream. The cadets' job was to integrate the streams into a unified environmental profile. It was computational work, mediated by the instrument's processing architecture. The cadet made interpretive decisions, weighting, prioritization, confidence calibration, but the data came from the array. In the holographic field, the large shape near the river had resolved. It was a herd. 6 animals, quadrupedal, heavy-bodied, moving upstream along the western bank. They'd been grazing in the river margin vegetation, and now they were moving. Not grazing movement, purposeful, directional, upslope. The herd had shifted from feeding behavior to transit behavior sometime in the last few minutes. I'd spent 6 years watching elk herds in the Cascades. Not studying them, I wasn't a wildlife biologist, but watching them, because when you're 3 days into a search and rescue operation in mountain terrain and the elk start moving, you pay attention to where and why. Elk don't think about where they're going. They respond. They read the pressure, the scent, the sound, the temperature gradient, and they move. If you can read the elk, you can read what the elk are reading. The mountain talks to the animals first. The animals talk to you if you're watching. These weren't elk. They were alien analogs in a holographic projection. But behavior is behavior. A herd that shifts from feeding to purposeful upslope transit has been moved by something, and the direction it moves tells you what moved it. Either a pressure gradient they were sensitive to, the weather system coming in, or a threat from the valley floor. I couldn't tell which from the behavioral pattern alone, but the direction was informative. They were moving upslope and east, toward the rockier terrain with less canopy cover. That was counter to what you'd expect from a weather shelter response. An animal seeking shelter from incoming rain would move into denser canopy, not away from it. So it wasn't the weather. Something on the valley floor had moved them. I scanned the lower valley. The canopy was too dense to see through at this resolution, but there was a gap, a natural clearing where a large tree had fallen, opening a window into the undergrowth. Something was in the clearing. Low, still, partially concealed by the fallen trunk. I couldn't make out detail at this distance and angle, but the posture was wrong for a herbivore. Too low, too still, too oriented toward the direction the herd had been. Predator ambush configured. Using the fallen tree as cover, the herd had detected it and moved. The predator hadn't pursued, which meant it was either a stalker that wouldn't chase once detected, or it was waiting for something else. I wrote predator presence, valley floor, NE clearing, ambush posture, Herd displacement upslope east. Non-pursuit after detection suggests stalking predator, not coursing. Threat radius estimate, 200 m from clearing center based on herd displacement distance. I looked at what I'd written. 3 paragraphs of margin notes on a compliance form that was supposed to document whether the Academy's enrollment practices met joint protocol standards for interspecies access. Section 4 of the form, Classroom Observation Notes, had a box for the auditor's observations on pedagogical methodology. I'd been writing in the space next to it. The wrong space. Old habits. I set the clipboard down and went back to watching the cadets. Dren Vos was deep in his assessment. His pressure organs were cycling rapidly, a sign of high-intensity sensory processing. He was cross-referencing the array's atmospheric data against his own pressure readings, using the biological advantage the Sulen had in this domain. His display showed a complex overlay of atmospheric layers, thermal gradients, and wind vector projections. It was detailed work. Good work. The other cadets were at various stages. Vethani in the second row was struggling with her geological calibration. The array's seismic sensitivity module required fine adjustments that her 4 hands should have made easier, but she was overcorrecting, chasing a calibration target that kept drifting. 2 Dreth cadets in the 4th row were working their biological assessment channels, angling their heads to catch the olfactory data the array was extracting from the holographic field's chemical simulation layer. The Dreth had the best nose in the room. Their problem was integrating scent data with the visual and atmospheric channels, which required a cognitive translation step that the array's interface didn't accommodate well. I noted the interface issue on the compliance form, the actual compliance form this time in the correct box. Cross-species ergonomic adaptation in the Kethvor interface was a legitimate audit observation. The array had been designed by Vethani engineers for Vethani operators. The Sulen adaptation was good. Their pressure organs interfaced cleanly with the atmospheric channel. The Dreth adaptation was poor. The olfactory channel existed but was bolted on, afterthought architecture. I'd seen the same pattern at other academies. The instrument was built for one species and retrofitted for others. It worked, but it worked unevenly. A human using this instrument would have no biological channel at all, no pressure organs, no olfactory array, no chromatophore feedback. Just eyes, ears, and hands on a console designed for fingers that weren't shaped like human fingers. The one human who had enrolled here hadn't reached the 3rd-term practicals. I was beginning to understand why the file had said curriculum incompatibility. 32 minutes in. Some cadets were finishing their primary passes and starting to compile their assessment reports. Dren Vos was already compiling. His display showed the 7 assessment categories laid out in the standard Kethvor report format: atmospheric profile, geological stability, biological threat index, resource availability, weather forecast, hazard summary, and operational recommendation. He was filling them in methodically, each category populated by the data his array had processed. I glanced at the holographic field again. The cloud deck had developed exactly as I'd estimated. The middle layer cumulus was building vertically now, the shadows on the valley floor darker and more defined. The leading edge of the precipitation was visible as a faint curtain of gray on the western horizon of the projected field. 22 minutes. I'd said 22 minutes 12 minutes ago. That put the rain arrival at roughly 10 minutes from now in the field's simulated timeline. The cadets who hadn't finished their atmospheric assessment by then would be working with different conditions than they'd started with, which would complicate their data integration. The river surface was showing something else. A faint, rhythmic disturbance in the ripple pattern, not wind-driven, not current-driven. It was coming from below. I'd seen the same thing once on a lake in the southern Alps, 3 hours before a moderate tremor. A colleague named Elsa had pointed at the water and said, "The lake is breathing." She was a geologist by training, rescue by vocation, and she had a way of saying things that stayed with you. The lake was breathing. The water was responding to microseismic activity at depth. The frequency was low, too low for the surface disturbance to be visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But I was looking for it, because I'd spent 14 years looking at water surfaces in mountain terrain, and that particular ripple pattern had taught me a lesson I'd only needed to learn once. The lesson was this: the ground tells the water before it tells you. If the water is moving wrong frequency, wrong rhythm, wrong relationship to the wind, then something is happening below the surface that the surface hasn't announced yet. It might be nothing. It might be a fault line warming up. The only way to know is to note it, monitor it, and make your decisions accordingly. In the field, the decision was simple: don't camp next to the cliff face until you've watched the water for an hour. In a classroom exercise, the decision was a notation on a margin. Geological microactivity, low magnitude, probably deep 10, 15 kilometers, not an immediate hazard but an indicator. The geological strata visible on the eastern ridge face showed fault lines. Old ones, stable, but present. A survey team on the ground would want to know about the microseismic signature before they set up camp. I wrote it in the margin. I was past caring which box it went in. 38 minutes. Drenvas submitted his report to the central console. He was first, as expected. His display cleared and he sat back, his pressure organs settling into a slower rhythm. Done. Velsarath walked to the central console and reviewed the submission. The instructor's chromatophores shifted, a brief pulse of warm amber through the slate there and gone. Approval. Then a flicker of something cooler. A pause. Velsarath's fingers moved across the console display, scrolling through the report's 7 categories. Your atmospheric profile is thorough, Cadet Drenvas. Weather forecast is within parameters. Biological threat index is. Velsarath paused. The chromatophores flickered again, a quick ripple of teal across the throat. You list the valley floor biome as Category 2 passive. What was your basis? The array's biological motion channel showed no predator-class movement signatures in the primary scan window, Drenvas said. Herbivore activity registered in the river corridor. No threat indicators above baseline. And the herd displacement. A pause. Drenvas's pressure organs flexed. The herd moved upslope during the observation window. I attributed the movement to atmospheric pressure change from the incoming weather system, a shelter-seeking response. The herd moved away from canopy cover. Another pause, longer this time. Drenvas looked at his console display as if it might offer something he'd missed. It didn't. The array had processed the biological motion data as a population distribution pattern. It had flagged the herd. It had not flagged the direction of the herd's movement as inconsistent with a weather shelter response, because the array's biological assessment algorithm didn't model behavioral motivation. It modeled presence and movement vectors. The why was the cadet's job. I will review the assessment, Drenvas said. His tone was even, but his pressure organs were cycling faster. Please do. Velsarath turned back to the central console. Other submissions were coming in. The instructor began reviewing them, chromatophores cycling through the same approval then pause pattern that suggested none of the reports were wrong, exactly, but none of them were complete either. The 40-minute window closed. The holographic field continued to run. The projected weather system was moving in now, the first veil of rain crossing the western ridge, but the assessment period was over. Velsarath deactivated the cadets' array connections to the field, freezing their data at the 40-minute mark. Assessment review will follow in the standard debrief window, Velsarath said. Rack your arrays. The cadets complied. The hum of the Kethvor units wound down as 31 arrays were powered off and returned to their docking mounts. The theater was quiet. The holographic field continued to play. Rain was falling now on the western face of the ridge, and the river was beginning to respond, but nobody was watching it. Except me. Velsarath climbed the tiers toward the observation row. This was standard. Post-observation protocol required the instructor to sign the auditor's attendance verification, a formality that confirmed I'd been present for the practical and that my observer badge was logged. It took 30 seconds and involved no conversation beyond "sign here." The instructor reached my row. I turned the clipboard to the attendance verification page and offered my pen. Velsareth took it, signed the line, and handed the pen back. The whole interaction lasted less than a minute. Then Velsareth's eyes moved to the compliance form. I'd left it open to the page I'd been writing on. Section 4, Classroom Observation Notes. The actual compliance observations, interface ergonomics, calibration timing, cross-species adaptation issues were in the correct boxes, written in my standard small, even hand. The margin notes were next to them, filling the white space between Section 4 and Section 5, running down the side of the page, continuing onto the back. I saw Velsareth read the first line of the margin notes. The chromatophores shifted. A slow, deep pulse of color, not the quick flickers I'd seen during the cadet reviews, but something heavier like a tide coming in. Amber first, then teal. Then a pattern I hadn't seen before, geometric, sharp-edged, radiating outward from the throat, in a configuration that I later learned was the Dren chromatophoric response to encountering information that contradicts a held assumption. The Dren called it a sever pattern. It happened when the chromatophore system detected a mismatch between incoming data and the neural model the Dren was operating from. The skin knew before the mind did. Velsareth's hands were still. That was the tell. A Dren instructor whose chromatophores are running a sever pattern but whose hands are still is a Dren who is choosing not to react until the processing is complete. I'd seen the same discipline in rescue coordinators. The moment when the radio report doesn't match the plan, and the coordinator goes very still while the options reshape themselves. Auditor Renner. Instructor. These notes. Velsareth's voice was the same even professional tone, but the chromatophores were telling a different story. The margin entries, what are they? Field observations. Of the survey field. Yes. Velsareth looked at the notes again. Read further. The chromatophores deepened. The geometric pattern spread from the throat to the forearms. You observed a 3-layer cloud system with a precipitation timeline of 22 minutes. From the start of the exercise, yes. The Kethvor array's atmospheric channel requires 11 to 14 minutes of calibrated data collection before producing a precipitation timeline estimate. Cadet Drenvos's report estimated 24 minutes. The array's post-exercise verification, Velsareth glanced toward the central console, has not yet been run, but the standard margin of accuracy for the instrument's weather forecast at this resolution is plus or minus 3 minutes. I understand. You wrote 22 minutes. A pause. You wrote it at 12 minutes into the exercise, before any cadet had completed a primary atmospheric pass. I didn't say anything. It wasn't a question. Velsareth read the next section of margin notes, the aquifer estimate, the soil gradient analysis, the vegetation stress indicators, the predator identification, the microseismic observation from the river surface. The chromatophores were doing something I hadn't seen in 16 previous Academy audits. The geometric patterns had resolved into a fixed configuration, sharp, symmetrical, occupying the instructor's entire visible skin surface from throat to fingertips. In Dren physiology, I later learned, this was called a lock pattern. It occurred when the chromatophore system stopped cycling through transient emotional responses and settled into a single, sustained state. The state was not shock, exactly. It was closer to what a human might call the moment of revision, the instant when the frame you've been using to understand something breaks, and you haven't built the new one yet. Auditor Renner, did you use an instrument to produce these observations? No. A data feed, a personal scanner, a reference database. No, I looked at the field. Below us, the cadets were racking their equipment. Drenvas had turned around again. He was watching the conversation he couldn't hear, his pressure organ cycling. Velsarath set the clipboard down on the narrow desk surface of the observation tier, very carefully, as if it contained something that might shift if handled wrong. I would like you to read your margin observations to the class. That's not within my audit protocol. I am aware of the protocol. I am requesting it as an instructional exercise under Section 9 of the Observer Guidelines, which permits the instructor to invite auditor input on matters of pedagogical relevance at the auditor's discretion. I knew Section 9. I'd written compliance reports referencing Section 9 at 3 other academies. It was the clause the Commission had inserted to allow auditors to flag procedural issues in real time rather than waiting for the written report. It was intended for situations like a safety violation or a discriminatory practice observed during a practical. It had never, as far as I knew, been invoked so an auditor could read his margin notes about cloud patterns to a room full of alien cadets. But it was within protocol. "All right," I said. Velsarath turned to the class. The chromatophores had settled into a new baseline, not the teaching slate, not the lock pattern, but something between them. Steady, attentive waiting. "Cadets, before the debrief, I have requested the auditor to share a set of field observations he compiled during the exercise. These observations were not produced using the Kethvor array or any instrumental system. Please listen carefully." 31 faces turned toward the back row. Drenvas's expression was unreadable, but his pressure organs had gone still, the Sulen equivalent of held breath. I picked up the clipboard. "Cloud system," I said. 3-layer structure. Upper layer cirrostype, moving west-northwest to east-southeast on a high-altitude current, speed approximately. I checked my note. 4 times the surface wind velocity based on shadow transit rate across the valley floor. Middle layer cumulus, building vertically from minute 8 of the exercise. Vertical development rate consistent with a convective column over the western ridge. Lower layer valley fog, pooling in the river corridor, indicating a thermal inversion at the valley floor level. I paused. The room was quiet. I continued. Precipitation timeline. Based on the rate of cumulus development in the middle layer and the advance rate of the upper layer cloud shadow, estimated onset of precipitation on the western ridge face at 22 minutes from exercise start. Valley floor precipitation approximately 3 to 5 minutes later. Wind shift from west-northwest to southwest, expected concurrent with the frontal passage. Velsarath was standing at the end of my row, very still. The chromatophores were running the geometric pattern again. "Soil and hydrology," I said. "Valley floor soil dark, organic, well-watered. Transition to paler, coarser composition at the canopy margin line on the eastern slope, following a contour consistent with a subsurface aquifer. Aquifer estimated depth 4 meters, based on the root depth differential between the river margin vegetation and the aquifer line vegetation. Accessible by excavation at the point where the vegetation stress line intersects the rockfall deposit on the eastern ridge face, approximately." I checked, grid reference 73 by 41. Drenvas opened his mouth, closed it. His pressure organs were cycling fast, rapid, shallow pulses that I'd learned to associate with cognitive processing under load. He was running my observations against what his array had told him. The array had not told him about the aquifer. The geological channel's subsurface resolution at this depth required a dedicated seismic pass that most cadets didn't run, because it wasn't part of the standard 7-category assessment template. "Biological threat assessment," I said. 6-unit herbivore herd western riverbank initially in grazing pattern. Herd displacement began at approximately minute 14. Direction: upslope east away from valley floor canopy and into open terrain. Displacement direction inconsistent with weather shelter response, which would predict movement into denser canopy. Assessed cause, predator presence on the valley floor. The room had changed. I could feel it the way you feel a room change when you've said something that rearranges the furniture. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Predator location, northeast clearing, approximately 200 meters from the herd's initial position. An opening in the canopy created by a fallen tree. The predator was positioned behind the fallen trunk in a low, still posture oriented toward the herd's grazing area. Non-pursuit after herd detection suggests a stalking-type predator rather than a coursing type. Threat radius estimated at 200 meters from the clearing center, based on the distance the herd moved before resuming normal transit behavior. I looked up from my notes. Velsareth was staring at me, not at the clipboard, at me. "There is one more observation," I said. "Geological microactivity." The river surface showed a non-current, non-wind-driven ripple disturbance beginning at approximately minute 7 of the exercise. Frequency was low and consistent with microseismic activity at depth, estimated 10 to 15 kilometers. The eastern ridge face shows visible fault lines in the exposed geological strata. These faults appear stable, but the microseismic signature suggests ongoing low-level activity. A ground-based survey team would benefit from a seismic monitoring protocol before establishing any fixed installation in the valley. I set the clipboard down. The silence held for 6 seconds. I counted them, because that's what you do when you've said something and the room hasn't decided how to respond. 6 seconds is a long time in a room full of 31 cadets and an instructor whose chromatophores have locked into a pattern you've never seen before. Drenvas broke it. That assessment required the Kethvor array. His voice was flat, not angry, something else. The atmospheric channel requires 11 minutes of calibrated data to produce a precipitation estimate. The biological channel requires a full-spectrum motion analysis to identify predator class behavior. The geological channel requires a dedicated seismic pass at sub-20-kilometer depth. You cannot have produced these observations by, he paused, and his pressure organs pulsed once, hard, looking. I didn't produce them, I said. I observed them. There's a distinction. The distinction is instruments. The distinction is methodology. Velsareth moved. The instructor walked down from the observation tier to the central floor, crossed to the console, and entered a command sequence. The holographic field was still running. The rain was heavier now, the river visibly higher, the valley fog breaking apart under the leading edge of the precipitation system. The instructor initiated the post-exercise verification protocol. The array's own archival analysis of the survey field, run at maximum resolution across all 7 assessment categories, using the full 40-minute data set. The results took 90 seconds to compile. The array had 40 minutes of multi-channel sensor data. I'd had my eyes and 12 minutes of marginal notes. Velsareth read the verification results on the central display. I could see the data from the observation tier 7 assessment categories, each with the array's archival output alongside whatever comparison framework the verification protocol used. The instructor scrolled through the first 3 categories slowly, then stopped, went back, read again. The chromatophores went through a sequence I hadn't seen before, rapid flickers of amber and teal chasing each other in tight geometric spirals, like a computation happening on the surface of the skin. Then the spirals collapsed into a slow, full-body flush of deep indigo that started at the fingertips and rolled inward toward the throat. I didn't know what it meant. I learned later that indigo in a Dren lock pattern signified the completion of a revision, the moment when the new frame has been built and the old one is no longer operative. Not shock, not awe, recalibration. The auditor's precipitation estimate was 22 minutes. The array's post-exercise verification places the onset at 21 minutes 40 seconds. Variance, 20 seconds. The room didn't breathe. The auditor's aquifer estimate was 4 meters at grid reference 73 by 41. The array's geological verification identifies a subsurface water feature at 3.8 meters at grid reference 72.9 by 41.1. Variance, 20 centimeters in depth, 1/10 of a grid unit in position. Drenvas's pressure organs had stopped cycling entirely. They were locked open, extended, motionless, in a Sulen configuration I'd never seen. Full sensory exposure. His biology was trying to take in everything the room was offering, because what the room was offering did not fit inside the framework his biology had been trained to use. 2 seats to his left, a Vethani cadet had set her stylus down on the desk surface and folded all 4 hands in what I recognized as the Vethani posture for formal processing. The equivalent of a human sitting very still, while something rearranges itself behind their eyes. The Dreth in the 4th row had their heads angled identically, both turned at the same degree, both catching whatever the room's chemical signature was telling them about 31 bodies experiencing the same cognitive event simultaneously. The auditor identified a predator presence in the northeast clearing. The array's biological verification confirms a stalking-class predator at the location described, oriented as described, with a calculated threat radius of 190 meters. The auditor estimated 200. Velsareth turned off the display. In 3 of the 7 assessment categories, weather timeline, biological threat identification, and geological microactivity, the auditor's margin notes match or exceed the array's output. In 2 of those 3 categories, the auditor's observations are more precise than the array's real-time data, and within the margin of the array's own post-exercise archival analysis. The auditor completed these observations within the first 12 minutes of the exercise, without an instrument, without a data feed, and without any sensor technology. The instructor looked up at me. 31 cadets looked up at me. Auditor Renner, how? I thought about how to answer that. There were several ways. I could have talked about the 400,000 years of hominin evolution that had produced a visual cortex capable of integrating multiple environmental data streams into a single, real-time threat and resource assessment without conscious processing. I could have talked about the persistence predator hypothesis, the theory that early humans survived not by being stronger or faster than the things that wanted to eat them, but by being better at reading the environment than anything else on the savannah. I could have talked about how every human child who has ever watched a cloud and said, "It's going to rain," is doing, in a rudimentary form, what the Kethvor array's atmospheric channel does with 11 minutes of calibrated sensor data. I didn't say any of that. I said what Harlan said to me on the hillside in eastern Oregon when I was 23, and I asked him how he knew where the water was. You learn to look, and then you look. The silence after that was different from the silence before. The first silence had been surprise. This one was something else. It was the sound of a room rearranging itself around a fact it didn't have a category for. Velsareth walked back up to the observation tier. The chromatophores had settled into a new configuration, steady, deep teal. The color I would later learn was the Dren baseline for active formal processing. The instructor was no longer teaching. The instructor was working. Auditor Renner, your compliance report will include observations on our environmental pattern recognition curriculum. It will. May I ask what those observations will say? I picked up the clipboard, turned to the compliance form, found the box I'd been looking for, Section 6, Curriculum Classification Observations. It was the section most auditors left blank, because most auditors didn't have anything to say about the curriculum itself. Their job was enrollment practices, not pedagogy. But Section 6 existed because the Commission's charter recognized that enrollment access and curriculum design were not entirely separate questions. If a curriculum was designed in a way that systematically excluded a species' capabilities, by testing only for abilities that species didn't have, or by failing to acknowledge abilities that species did, then the curriculum itself was an enrollment barrier. I wrote the observation. It took about 4 minutes. I was aware of the room watching me write, but I'd been watched while writing compliance forms before. It didn't change my handwriting. When I finished, I read it back to Velsareth, not because the protocol required it, because the instructor had asked. Section 6. Curriculum Classification Observations. The Environmental Pattern Recognition course at Velaran Academy of Environmental Sciences is currently classified as instrument-dependent, Tier 3, under the Vethani Curriculum Standards Framework. This classification assumes that environmental pattern recognition at the operational level requires the Keth-Vor Environmental Analysis Matrix or equivalent instrumental system. During the observed practical, the auditor compiled a comprehensive field assessment of the holographic survey environment using no instruments, no data feeds, and no sensor technology. This assessment, produced within the first 12 minutes of the 40-minute exercise window, matched or exceeded the instrument array's output in 3 of 7 assessment categories, as verified by the array's own post-exercise archival analysis. The methodology used, direct visual, auditory, and contextual observation, interpreted through species baseline environmental pattern recognition, is a documented capability of H. sapiens, arising from the species' evolutionary history as a generalist environmental reader in a high-variability biosphere. This capability is neither assessed nor acknowledged in the current course structure. Recommendation: reclassification of the Environmental Pattern Recognition course from Instrument-Dependent, Tier 3, to Mixed Methodology, acknowledging the existence of at least one enrolled species in the Joint Enrollment Charter that possesses baseline organic environmental assessment capability independent of instrumental methodology. Recommend further that the curriculum be amended to include an assessment pathway for non-instrument-based environmental pattern recognition to ensure enrollment access parity under Human Vethani Protocol 7, Section 4, Clause 11. I set the clipboard down. Velsareth's chromatophores were still deep teal, the lock pattern held. The instructor's hands, both of them, were flat on the observation tier desk, fingers spread, the way you brace yourself when the ground is steady but something else has shifted. Auditor Renner. Instructor. In 208 years of this academy's operation, no compliance auditor has recommended a curriculum reclassification. I'm aware of that. In 208 years, no one has assessed a survey field in this theater without an instrument. I'm not sure that's true. I think it's possible that no one was asked. Velsareth looked at me for a long moment, the teal deepened by one shade. Then the instructor turned and walked down to the central console and entered a series of commands that I recognized from 16 previous audits as the beginning of a formal curriculum review process, the kind that produced a paper trail, the kind that ended with a classification change in the Academy's official registry. Dren Voss was still in his seat. He hadn't moved since the verification readout. His pressure organs had returned to a slow, steady cycle, the Sulen resting rhythm, the one that meant the sensory system had finished processing and was now simply present, taking in the room at baseline resolution. He didn't say anything to me. He didn't need to. The pressure organs said it. They were cycling at a frequency I'd seen once before, at a different academy, on a different Sulen face, in a moment that had meant the same thing. The instrument I trained on has been operating inside a frame I didn't know was a frame. The curriculum reclassification went through the same day. Velsareth filed it under Section 6 of my compliance report, cross-referenced to the Academy's own post-exercise verification data. The Environmental Pattern Recognition course at Velaran Academy of Environmental Sciences was reclassified from instrument-dependent, Tier 3, to mixed methodology, with a notation that read, reclassification initiated on the basis of Compliance Observation 12 VAS 7, demonstrating the existence of non-instrumental environmental assessment methodology at operational resolution. Auditor's margin notes archived as reference Annex VAS 12R. My margin notes. 3 paragraphs of field observations written in the white space of a compliance form because old habits don't have an off switch. And a survey field is a survey field whether it's made of light or made of rock and weather, and the sound of water moving over stone. I saw Dren Voss once more during the audit, on the second day. He was in the corridor outside Lecture Theater 7, standing by a window that overlooked the valley below the academy. He was looking at the terrain, not with an instrument, not with a data pad, just looking. When he heard me coming, his pressure organs cycled once and settled. He didn't turn around. I have been trying to see what you see, he said. The vegetation line, the cloud structure. I can read the atmospheric pressure through my organs, but the visual field, I process it as color and shape, not as data. It's not data, I said. It's pattern. Your instruments turn it into data. My eyes skipped the step. He was quiet for a moment. His pressure organs pulsed slowly, the deep, steady rhythm I'd come to recognize as a Sulan in concentrated thought. Is it teachable? I thought about that, about Harlan on the hillside, about the 1,000 small corrections that had happened between the age of 23, when I first learned to look for the aquifer line, and the age of 37, when I could glance at a hillside from a helicopter and estimate groundwater depth within a meter. About how much of it was instruction and how much was exposure, the slow accumulation of pattern that comes from years of being in the terrain, making decisions that mattered, learning what mattered by getting it wrong and still being alive afterward to get it right. Some of it, I said, the principles, yes, the speed takes time. He nodded. It was a human gesture. I didn't know where he'd learned it, but it landed right. I finished the audit in 3 days. The rest of it was administrative, enrollment records, admissions criteria, interspecies accommodation standards, normal compliance work. I filled out forms. I attended meetings. I ate in the faculty annex, which served food that was edible in the way that institutional food everywhere is edible, regardless of the species that designed the menu. On the last day, Coordinator Orathsen met me at the shuttle apron to retrieve the observer badge. She held it in 2 of her 4 hands and looked at me with the measured, formal expression that Vethani used for interactions that had exceeded their expected parameters. Auditor Renner, the curriculum reclassification has generated attention at the registry level. Several other academies have requested the reference annex. They're welcome to it. Instructor Velsarath has proposed a new module for the Environmental Pattern Recognition course, Baseline Organic Assessment. It would cover non-instrumental observation methodology. The proposal cites your compliance observation as the foundational case study. That's the instructor's prerogative. She paused. 2 of her hands made the small adjustment that I'd learned meant she was about to say something that was not in the protocol. The instructor asked me to convey that the module will require a practical demonstration component. The Academy does not currently have a staff member capable of demonstrating non-instrumental environmental assessment at the level documented in your report. I understood what she wasn't saying. I also understood that my job was compliance auditing, not curriculum development, and that the next academy on my schedule was a flight training institute on a station orbiting a gas giant 6 relay jumps from here. Tell the instructor I'll include the observation in my summary report to the commission. If they decide a follow-up visit is warranted, they'll assign it. The instructor anticipated that response. The instructor also asked me to convey that the survey field in Lecture Theater 7 is available for informal observation at any time, should you find yourself in the vicinity. I'll keep that in mind. She returned the badge to her pocket. I picked up my bag, a standard issue commission field kit, scuffed at the corners from 16 previous assignments, and boarded the shuttle. The hatch closed, and the apron fell away below as the shuttle lifted through the cloud layer, and the Academy became another clean white shape on a surface of green and brown and gray. I looked out the forward display as we climbed. Below, the terrain resolved the real terrain, not a projection. Mountains, river systems, valleys with canopy cover and cleared ridgelines. Cloud formations building in the west, stacked in layers, moving at different speeds on different currents. I could see the vegetation lines where the soil changed composition. I could see the shadow patterns that told me where the sun was and how the light was moving. I could see the way the water in the rivers caught the light at different angles depending on the current speed and the wind. I looked at my clipboard. The compliance form for Velaran was complete, filed, and ready for submission. In the margin of the last page, below my signature, there was one note I hadn't included in the official observation. I'd written it on the shuttle apron while waiting for Coordinator Orath Sen, looking north toward the Academy's perimeter. Subsurface thermal gradient visible in the vegetation line at the Academy's northern boundary. Root depth differential indicates geothermal feature at approximately 6 meters. Recommend maintenance review of the Academy's geothermal cooling system within 6 standard months. I closed the clipboard. The shuttle reached orbit. Below, the terrain became a map and then a curve and then just light.